Hi, I'm Brian O'Shea. What I'm going to be doing today is telling you about my efforts to understand how the early universe, so the first galaxies in the universe, connect to the present day universe, and specifically connect to galaxies that we see in our own local group. And this is an incredibly challenging set of computational problems that needs a computer like Blue Waters. And in fact, I'm doing this as part of two separate PRACs. One of which my co-PI Michael Norman is here, and the other of which my co-PIs David Collins and John Wise are not here. And so my list of collaborators is down there in the bottom left. Their affiliations are over here on the right. Anyway, and it's really a pleasure to be here. So what I am curious about is the evolution of galaxies over the age of the universe. And so this is a picture of the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, Hubble Space Telescope not shown to scale. And one of the things that we learned from the Hubble Deep Field is that galaxies change properties quite a bit over cosmic time. And we're really used to seeing pictures on the web, for those of you that are ever on the internet, right, of things like this, like pretty spiral galaxies and maybe the occasional elliptical galaxy up there. But everything in this picture is a galaxy except for maybe a handful of stars, and of course the Hubble Space Telescope. And so, and what you see when you look further back in time, so when you look at more distant galaxies, and because the speed of light is finite, the further away it is, the further back in time the light was emitted from it, so you're sort of seeing this time machine effect as you look at more and more distant things. What you see is that those highest redshift galaxies look nothing like the galaxies today. Now, the photons are redshifted because the universe has expanded, but some of the things that we see are that these galaxies early on in the universe are big gas-filled blobs, small gas-filled blobs that are forming stars like crazy, that don't have these beautiful spiral and elliptical structures that you tend to see in the largest galaxies today. And so we're really interested in how the universe makes this change over the age of the universe from these little tiny blobby forming stars like crazy things to the large, relatively sedate objects we see in the universe today. And there's two ways to get at this. One of them is to use something like this. This is the James Webb Space Telescope. It persists in being about to launch. And so hopefully in a couple years it'll actually be able to launch. But it is an amazing telescope because it has an aperture that's much, much larger than the Hubble Space Telescopes. And it can see to much longer wavelengths. And so when it looks at, when it is launched and when it is functional, it's going to see what this first generation of galaxies, these very, very early galaxies, look like. And so we're making predictions directly to that. But that's a direct way of getting at it. There's also a very indirect way of getting at the connection between the very, very early universe and the present day. Because we know that galaxies form by the process of hierarchical merger. So early on in the universe, all galaxies start out as these little objects, and they merge together to make bigger things and bigger and bigger and bigger things over time. And what you have at the end are large galaxies like the Milky Way surrounded by lots of little satellites, many of which are relics of that first era of galaxy formation, or so we believe. And this is a picture of, courtesy of Anna Frabel at MIT, showing a bunch of these really small galaxies. And so they're called ultra-faint dwarfs. They have thousands or tens of thousands of stars in them, and they all formed in the first billion years of the universe. And since then, they have done not that much. And they're mostly in orbit around the Milky Way, or the ones that we see are mostly in orbit around the Milky Way. They're very, very tiny, they're very dim, they're really hard to find. But because they have such old stellar populations and such low metallicity and just these very, very ancient stellar populations, we think that we can use them in this archaeological sense to learn about those first generations of galaxies. And so what we're trying to do is make that connection between what JWST is going to see in the very earliest stages of the universe and what we can see as sort of relics of that era in orbit around our own galaxy at the present day. And then here's a picture of one of those. All of the points in the back are actually the galaxy that was found with, I believe it was the Dark Energy Survey. Nope, this one was the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. Anyway, but they're very tiny and they're very hard to find. Okay, so the big questions that we're trying to ask with these simulations are these ones. So, how did the first generation of stars affect later generations of galaxies? So in other words, well, we'll get to it in a second, but what are the observable properties of those earliest generations of galaxies? In other words, when JWST gets launched, opens up, looks at the universe, what's it going to see? And then how do those earliest galaxies relate to the Milky Way and to the Milky Way environment? And what can we learn about that? And of course, this is a really challenging problem. But why is it a challenging problem? So first off, it's a complex physics. I'm just walking over here to get water, sorry. It's very complicated because we have cosmology. The universe is expanding. We have to worry about gravity. We have to worry about hydrodynamics. We have to worry about chemistry in the gas. We have to worry about radiation transport. We have to worry about how stars form, evolve, and feed energy and metals back into the universe and radiation back into the universe. And all of this stuff is happening simultaneously. So it's complicated, highly nonlinear. Also, there's an enormous dynamic range. When you're studying galaxies and you work out sort of the ratio of the largest scales that you realistically need to simulate to think you're doing a good job compared to sort of the scales of the star-forming regions where those stars are forming. So you have about a factor of 1,000,000 in space and time. And then finally, you have an issue of statistics, because simulating one galaxy isn't going to cut it. We look at populations of galaxies as astronomers because galaxies evolve on very, very long time scales compared to the human lifetime. So all we can do is look at a population and try to understand the growth and the evolution of that population based on a snapshot. And so we have to do large samples of galaxies as well to try to make that comparison in a meaningful way. And the outcome is a supercomputer-worthy problem. So we have to do this on blue waters. We have to do it on a big chunk of blue waters with order 100 million hours of CPU time. So it's quite the challenging thing. So now what I'm going to do is tell you about some results from the PRAC that we're just winding down, and then I'm going to tell you about what we're doing with our new PRAC. And unfortunately, there are no results because the simulations are running right now. And for when you're trying to compare to something that's at the present day in the universe, you unfortunately have to get through 13.7 billion years of stuff before you get to that. So it takes a while is what I'm saying. Anyway, so I want to tell you about two projects. One has to do with how the universe transitions from being free of metals, everything heavier than hydrogen and helium, to metal-rich, all the stuff that we're made out of that we care about, and then also evolution of very early galaxy populations. Okay, so I've spent a lot of my career trying to understand the properties of the earliest generations of stars in the universe. And we know that all of the elements heavier than hydrogen and helium in the universe are formed by cataclysmic events in stars, are formed in stars, and all the really heavy stuff gets formed in some sort of explosive event. And so you might ask yourself, well, what happens, what do stars that are formed out of just hydrogen and helium look like compared to ones that have all that extra stuff in them? And we believe that they're quite different. We believe that that first generation of stars were typically rather massive. They are very hot, so they produce lots of ultraviolet radiation. And they may even form the seeds for the supermassive black holes that we see in the center of essentially every massive galaxy today. And other people who are speaking today are going to talk more about that, so I'm going to just skate right by that one. But what we were trying to do in these calculations is to try to have a really detailed understanding of how the first stars, which you call population 3 stars, enrich the universe with metals and how they affect the regions around them and how that all takes place. And so we did this, so don't worry about all the numbers unless you really, really want to. But what we did was extremely high resolution cosmological simulations, incredibly high resolution. And we followed the formation of the primordial stars. Then we followed the ionizing radiation from those primordial stars and the supernovae, and watched as that metal-enriched gas from that supernovae blasted out of the halo, did its thing, and then collected in a neighboring halo. And this is sort of a case study for one way that you can get metal enrichment in early galaxies. And we actually have several other simulations looking at different scenarios, but we're actually still analyzing that data, so I'm just going to show you the published one. And part of this process is understanding how the metal affects the gas. And we know that all that stuff that's heavier than helium is really important because it affects both the chemistry and the cooling in the gas and can really profoundly affect the second generation of stars. And so we include really detailed treatments of all of that, and of course the radiation transport. Okay, so now on to the good stuff, the movies. So this is a movie done by my collaborator Britton Smith. On the left over here is a projection of the baryon density, so just the gas. Over here, it's temperature. This is a scale that tells you the physical size. That's going to change over the simulation. This slider bar down here starts over here. We use redshift on the top. You might want to look at this. This is the time since the Big Bang on the bottom. This is going to move from left to right, and it'll show you what's going on. And I want to warn you, the scales for density and temperature are going to change as stuff collapses, so just keep an eye on that. Okay, so let's watch this. So the universe is evolving. Gas is collapsing over here. You can see it's getting hotter a little bit. Well, it gets colder, and then it gets hotter as it really collapses. The first star is going to form and produce a tremendous amount of radiation. It will be extremely obvious if you look at the right-hand side, and there we go. It's producing tremendous amounts of radiation, and now it's exploding as a supernova. And this is actually, we've toggled over to showing metallicity, so metal fraction. And this is the metal-enriched gas blowing that halo apart, like blowing all the gas out of that halo and expanding outwards into the intergalactic medium. But nothing happens because there's nothing else around there. So what we're going to do now is zoom into sort of a suburb of that and watch what happens. So there's another Pot3 star that forms, metal-enriched gas flows out, and it's washing over this neighboring halo. And there's all sorts of wonderful hydrodynamic instabilities and stuff going on in there as well. But now time is going to slow down as we start zooming in, and we're watching this wave of metal-enriched gas wash over this halo and start to mix into the gas in that halo as the gas in the center of the halo is cooling off and getting denser and contracting and starting to form stars. And so what we're doing is we're zooming in and in and in, and you can see this number getting smaller and smaller and smaller as we zoom into from millions of light year scales to essentially the size of our own solar system to look at one cloud of star-forming gas that's forming a bunch of little stars or a bunch of little protostellar clouds inside of it. And so now we're getting down to, this is about, well, generously the size of the solar system. Now we're getting down to roughly, the Neptune orbit. But what we see over here when we look in the density are all of these little sort of isolated little red blobs, which are actually gravitationally bound clouds of gas. And those are much smaller than the standard population 3 stars, these first generations of stars. And so what we think we're doing is we're actually seeing that transition from metal-free to metal-poor star formation by essentially gas washing over this halo and mixing in. And there's not very much gas in there either. And then, as I said, we did this with different kinds of chemistry. One of the things that we did was look at the effect of dust. And so dust, just like the dust that you find, underneath your dresser and so on, is something that happens in stars and various other places possibly in the universe. We know that it's around. We know that it's chemically very important because it is a good coolant, and it also catalyzes the formation of things like molecular hydrogen. And so we did a couple of simulations where we turned on dust and a couple where we turned it off. I would be willing to speak at great length about that if you want to ask later. But what we found was that having dust in these simulations helps cooling. And it helps cooling because that dust, the surface of the dust grains, catalyzes the formation of molecular hydrogen, and it causes a huge amount of cooling, and that cooling causes fragmentation to occur. And when we actually go and look at the number of gravitationally bound clumps, we see that in the simulations with dust, there are many, many tens of these. And in the simulations without dust, there's maybe 2 or 3, not very many at all. And so this gives us some idea of what the extrema are in terms of this star formation. And then we can also analyze these simulations and look at all of the neighboring halos to try to understand if we carried the simulations further, which we didn't because we ran out of computing time. I'm sure you can all sympathize. What we might see. And what we found in this particular region in particular was that supernova blast wave washed over all of these halos and enriched them with a really wide variety of metallicities. So different content of metal in each one of them that varied by about 2 orders of magnitude. And that's very interesting because our observer colleagues, when they look at these ultra-faint dwarfs and other metal-poor populations of stars in the local group, in the Milky Way and its environs, there's a real tendency to associate age, so the older something is, the less metal it must have. And we're finding out that that's simply not true. And so you can have one supernova that enriches lots of halos to very, very different metallicities, and all these stars are basically the same age. And that's quite interesting. And the less metal-rich ones can form after the more metal-rich ones, which is also entertaining. OK, how much time do I have left, by the way? Oh, 5 minutes. OK, well then, we'll be quick. So then I want to tell you a little bit about our second set of simulations, which we've decided to call the Renaissance simulations, because we got to have a snappy name. And what we're trying to do is understand the evolution of entire early galaxy populations. So the simulation I just showed you was one specific example of one case study of how you form a metal-enriched star. But if you think back to my motivation for this, we need to do lots of galaxies to have good statistics. And so what we did was, again, don't worry about what it says up there, you can just listen to me, a large simulation volume where we picked 3 regions that have thousands of galaxies in them, or hundreds of galaxies in them, at the redshifts at the times we're interested in. And then we zoomed in on just a few specific separate regions and did simulations with essentially parsec resolution at the redshifts we cared about, with lots of adaptive mesh, very high resolution, all the chemistry I was talking about before, and radiation transport. And we followed ionizing radiation and photodissociating radiation with the radiation transport. And we formed these POP3 stars. We followed the metal enrichment of the universe. And then we did the metal-enriched stellar populations as well. And so now, this is why I wanted to close some of the windows. This is actually a movie that was made at NCSA by the Advanced Phys Lab, flying through one of these simulations. And so the Advanced Phys Lab did this. I can't take credit. But the blue stuff is neutral hydrogen. The red and yellow is ionized hydrogen, so essentially hot gas. And then if you look over here and see these sort of glowing white regions, those are regions where there are massive stars, so populations of stars that have just formed that are busy ionizing the universe right then. And so one of the things that my eye is immediately drawn to when I look at this volume rendering is that these regions of ionized gas from these galaxies are distinct. At the present day, the universe is totally reionized. And so everywhere in the intergalactic medium, the universe is reionized. But here, we're at the very beginnings of that process. And the universe is very dense. Gas recombines very quickly. And so around every galaxy, there is a struggle between the stellar populations producing photons and the gas trying to recombine, the electrons and protons recombining and becoming neutral again. And so that's why you have these little clouds around all of these galaxies. And if we continue this on for another 500 million years, we should be able to see the galaxies and the stars eventually winning this battle in the H2 regions. The ionizing regions get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually just subsuming the entire volume. But we didn't because, again, ran out of computer time. So, but hopefully this gives you some sense of what's actually in this simulation. And one of the most interesting results that's come out of this was that we found that in these simulations, the number of low-mass galaxies, low-luminosity galaxies, is actually strongly suppressed. And so this dashed dotted line over here, these are all estimates from observations of what the luminosity function should be, the number of galaxies per unit brightness. And so because we're astronomers, we have to use weird units. So we use magnitudes, and more negative means brighter. So over here, we have the bright stuff. Over here, we have the dim stuff. It's all per volume. So you have very few really bright things and lots of dimmer things. And so what we expect to see is a huge population of very dim galaxies. And in our simulations, what we see from these 3 different volumes is that this tips over, and that as you go to less bright galaxies, the luminosity function flattens out and then eventually quenches, and you just don't get any galaxy formation at all. And this is a combination of 2 factors. And one of those is that as we go to lower and lower mass galaxies, they form stars more efficiently. And so if I said, well, the total mass of the galaxy is some number, what fraction of that is actually in stars? In high mass galaxies like the Milky Way, that number is relatively large. But as you go to these lower and lower mass galaxies, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And in the lowest mass galaxies we simulate, it's like 10 to the minus 4. So 0.01% of all the matter in those galaxies is actually in stars because it forms extremely inefficiently. And then the other thing that we see is that some of the halos, some of the smaller halos, simply do not form stars. And we hypothesize that this is due to radiation from all of the neighboring halos prohibiting that primordial star formation to occur which keeps metal enrichment from happening, which keeps gas from falling into those halos and making stars. And in fact, when we look at sort of 10 to the 8 solar mass halos, we see they mostly have stars in them, but going down in order of magnitude in mass, we see almost nothing. And then putting those two effects together, both the decrease in star formation efficiency in these low mass galaxies and that radiative feedback, gives us a toy model that describes the data very well. Okay, so I'm basically out of time, so let me just very briefly, sorry, should have, just mention our second PRAC, which is trying to connect to the Milky Way. And it turns out this is a really interesting challenge because there are things that we don't know about the Milky Way. We don't know some critical things. We don't know exactly how much the Milky Way weighs, what its mass is. And we also don't have a very good grasp on the formation history of the Milky Way. And so, so it makes it very hard for us to go prospecting in cosmological simulations to find galaxies that we think are truly analogous to the Milky Way. And there are a lot of properties of galaxies that we think depend very strongly on the mass and the formation history. And so what we're doing in our second project is actually looking at halos with many different formation histories. And so this is growth as a function of log time. A more interesting metric is growth as a function of the final mass in log time. And what you see is that halos that are all the same size as the Milky Way, or approximately the same size as the Milky Way, have this tremendous variation in formation history. And so what we've done with our second project is actually look at a variety of galaxies in sampling through the formation history and galaxy environment and so on. And we're trying to address a whole bunch of questions relating to sort of the evolution of baryons in the universe over this cosmic time and how you connect those very early generations of galaxies to the Milky Way and the Milky Way stellar halo and to these ultraviolet faint dwarfs. Okay, so takeaways from this talk. Hopefully, you have taken away that transition between POP3 and metal-enriched star formation is quite complex and that dust is important. Also, we've found that star formation in these very early galaxies is inefficient, and in some galaxies, it's actually, star formation is quenched entirely. And what this results in is very few low luminosity galaxies in our simulation, which is quite interesting. And then, we didn't talk about that one, but also we are working with our second PRAC on trying to more explicitly make the connections between these very, very early galaxies and the stellar populations that we see in the local group today that are actually a lot easier for us to observe. So, all right, thank you very much.